Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here after, 28 years having graduated in podiatry from Plymouth a long time ago, and little did I envisage that the events that have occurred career-wise would result in me speaking before you this evening. It's a joy to be here. I had an absolutely fabulous time in Plymouth, and for me with podiatry, it's where it all started. And sometimes I think that gets forgotten, so anything I can do to help any of the current students with their careers going forwards, I'm more than happy to do so wherever I can. Podiatry is a very varied profession. It's probably the best analogy is really to dentistry, where you have different sectors of it. And I was elected as Dean of Podiatric Surgery at the Directorate of Podiatric Surgery within the College of Podiatry last August, which is a 3-year stint, having served 3 years on the faculty board beforehand. And it's an elected post, it's not an appointment by my peers. So as you can imagine, that having never ever looked for this position it was quite astonishing that my peers felt that the time was right, that I should sort of take hold of the steering wheel for the next 3 years. So it's a real pleasure to be able to associate that along with Plymouth, and also the event of 15 years ago in the creation of forensic gait analysis, the ability to identify people by the way they walk or by features of their walk, and we'll come on to that. I don't really wish to give you an in-depth maths and physics story this evening. I'll only send you, the next 20 minutes will give you an overview of what this area is, what it does, what it doesn't do, and where it's going in the near future and probably in the distant future as well.
When it comes to detecting crime, our walk, or gait, can hold vital clues. And Haydn Kelly is here, who is a specialist in gait analysis. Good morning, Haydn. What exactly does that involve?
Well, gait analysis is the style or the manner in which a person walks, and forensic gait analysis is the identification of persons by the way they walk or by features of their walk.
And it's not just about feet, is it, at all?
No, it's not. I mean, a person's gait involves everything from their head movements through to their arms, shoulders, torso, legs, knees, feet. The whole body movement is what we're looking at.
Okay, now you're actually in the Guinness Book of Records yourself, aren't you, as the first man to use gait analysis forensically back in 2000 for a case. So what was that?
That was back in July 2000. It was the first time forensic gait analysis was admissible as evidence in criminal law, and it surrounded a series of jewellery robberies in southeast England, and the gait analysis was a key component in that matter.
Congratulations. Now, forensic gait analysis was also used successfully in the Bradford riots, wasn't it? Tell me about that.
Yes, that's a while ago, and it was a matter of public disorder, and the element where gait analysis was involved was in an aspect where someone tried to set fire to a Labour club, and gait analysis along with other forensic tools was part of the evidence in that case also.
Okay, now we've got some CCTV of it, which you want to talk us through. Let's just have a look at this. This is actually one of the people convicted of that disorder. And what are we looking at here, Haydn?
Well, on the left-hand side, you've got the person who's actually in the riot itself, and it doesn't show the actual incident and doesn't need to, but it's a person they were interested in. On the right-hand side of the screen, you've got the suspect under surveillance, and what we're simply doing is looking at an unknown person on the left and scientifically comparing that to a known person on the right. The aspect we're interested in is the person's right foot and how that right foot moves, but more importantly, the magnitude of that movement.
Okay, we're just going to have another look now, and it was that right foot, you say, that had that distinctive movement that was able to match them up together and being one and the same person.
Yes, it's a brief clip of the actual riot itself on this particular piece of footage, but we've got more footage available on the right-hand side of the screen, which perhaps shows it more clearly. Okay,
well, let's have a go. We're going to put it to the test now, Haydn, all this advice. What we've done here, our team has mocked up a crime. This isn't a real crime, and this isn't a real criminal. It's one of our staff members. Now, using the gait, as you've just described, in a moment we're going to see 3 different people, and I am going to guess which one is the offender. So here we go, here's 3 people. Now one of those was the person in the VT that we just saw, and they all look pretty similar to me, I'm going to be honest, but I'm going to say, let's say B. Haydn, any guesses as to who it could be?
Oh, I would go with A.
Okay, and I am being told in my ear, in fact you are correct, it was A. Why would you say A?
Well, you saw from the first piece of footage that the person walks with very abducted feet. In later,
let's try and have another look at that. You're saying abducted, is that pointing outwards?
Correct.
Okay, so we're going to see him here. You could notice that his feet were pointing out slightly. In fact, they completely are. Haydn, you're totally right. And that was enough for you to realise from those 3 people which one was the same person.
That's correct.
Fascinating stuff, and that is why you do that for a living, and that's why I don't, Haydn. So thank you for joining us.
Well, hopefully that gives you probably as good an explanation as I can give you on in that sort of 3 minutes of what this is and what it's not. And as defined in the first ever case back in July 2000, forensic gait analysis is essentially the identification of persons by their gait, the style or manner in which they walk, or by features of their gait. And you saw 2 examples on that clip of the everted foot position of the person committing the arson attack in the Bradford riots, and you saw the person with the abducted feet, or the very abducted feet. And without getting too technical, both of those movements are normal movements when a person walks. The relevance is, as was illustrated in the presentation for the BBC, is the magnitude of those movements. And it's when certain movements become very large, or if you can measure the acceleration of movements, or if you can look at the velocity of movements. So I'm not going to get into that now. But that's when things start to become significant, because you're looking at the small numbers of the individuals who have these particular movements with those features of gait. And then you'll look to see what other features of gait are displaying. And on the left-hand side of the screen, as you saw earlier, you had the unknown person, the event at the crime scene. And you always have to look at the unknown first, and then look at the known second. And the reason for that is very straightforward. It's to avoid something called confirmation bias. If you examine the material on the known person, the person in custody or under surveillance, as you saw on that clip earlier, if you examine that material first and then you then look at the CCTV footage, that material is null and void in terms of evidential material. And I'm sure you can imagine the potential consequences of that happening in the middle of a trial. We're looking at movements from the head to the feet. We're not just talking about foot movements. In fact, the feet only come into play during gait when the foot actually hits the ground, and that's arguably the last event that occurs from when a person begins to walk. So we're looking at things from the front on and from 2 planes from the side. And without getting again too technical, it's just to give you some idea as to how we look at movement. We wouldn't be looking to compare someone from the side with a person walking from the front or behind. But we might look to compare someone walking from the front with someone walking from behind, because it's in the same plane. Just in case you were in any doubt. So when did gait analysis begin? Well, this is a familiar picture to you all, and we can go a long way back in terms of when we first start to look at when human movement was looked at. It's a long time ago. As far back as Plato, who started to link human movements of the body to transcendental geometric shapes, and then things moved on to a whole variety. And I can give you 3 slides of information on just the history of gait analysis, let alone its forensic application. It didn't really occur until 2000. But the slide you saw previously essentially relates to what we know about Galen, who essentially was for those of you who don't know, was a doctor to the gladiators and in the period of Marcus Aurelius. And essentially what he did was that, bear in mind lots of things we take for granted today we're not even known about. But what he was looking at, along with the many things that he covered, some that he did very well, unrelated to gait, and some that we know historically he didn't do very well in hindsight. But what he looked at was to see, well, why was the person that he might think would win the contest defeated? And he was looking at locomotion. They didn't know about centre of gravity and low centres of gravity in those times. So they were just looking at locomotion, or he was looking at locomotion of humans and trying to work out why these contests were perhaps not as predictable as one might first think. And then again, if we move forwards to sort of the 50s really, someone who really pushed clinical gait analysis from a podiatric perspective in the USA and globally really at the time was when we were starting to use clinical gait analysis as a diagnostic tool in terms of can we treat people with injuries by analysing their gait? Are there mechanisms dysfunctional in a person's gait that lead to injuries? Yes, there are. And Merton Root really pushed that on quite heavily in the 50s. A lot of the things he produced and brought out are still standing today, and some of the things have been challenged, and rightly so, in terms of the more detailed mechanisms of how gait analysis is performed. So what actually happened back in 2000? Well, if you take the view that there's nothing new, and that anything new is an amalgamation of things that are already in existence, then forensic gait analysis fits into that box very neatly, because it was actually very simple what actually occurred. And the process was this. In November 1999, I was at Dean's Yard, which is a conference centre, where there is a conference centre, which is near to the Houses of Parliament next to Westminster School. It's an expert witness conference run annually for everyone from accountants to zoologists. And I was approached by someone purely by chance, who was an image analyst used to looking at satellite images, which are much better than anything else, by the way, in terms of image quality. And the conversation evolved into a case that they were dealing with, which was the very first case you heard about on the BBC clip earlier, in relation to a series of robberies. And the exact words from this person were, well, we've got something at the moment that's more medical than what we do. And from then, it then evolved. And then in January 2000, I received a phone call from the flying squad, which, those of you who don't know much about the law enforcement agencies, are the section in the Metropolitan Police in London that deals with corporate robbery. And it was a question as to whether could I actually help them with their inquiries, in terms of they had a series of videos in relation to jewellery robberies over London and South East England, and they had some surveillance footage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So, but what it really was doing was this. It was bringing together what you see on the left-hand side of images taken from CCTV. It was taking analysis of a person's movements and deploying it in a legal system. So you've got a Venn diagram effect there, of which forensic gait analysis sits right in the centre. Small piece right in the centre of it all. And the very first case was R versus Saunders. This was taken from the front page of the Independent newspaper on the 13th of July. I won't bore you with all the details, but it said, I'll read the first part for you. It says, like any self-respecting jewellery shop robber, John Saunders wore a mask, gloves, and even 2 pairs of trousers, one of which he would discard after a heist to aid his disguise. But the one thing the gang leader could not alter, his peculiar gait, was caught on CCTV. In the vernacular of his native Yorkshire, he could not have stopped a pig in a passage. So it effectively was, here you have the very first case of forensic gait analysis, so someone being identified by the use of gait. It wasn't the only forensic tool that was used in that case. And as those that you may know, identification is a jigsaw of evidence. There's very rarely one tool that's relied upon. And even if you take the gold standard of DNA identification and other tools at the other end of the spectrum, they're all based on probability. There are no absolutes in this. So it invariably is a jigsaw of evidence as to what is suitable, what is appropriate, what is and what's not. And not only was it the very first case, the relevance of it was you have a situation here where someone has attempted by use of clothing to disguise the way they walk. And we'll come on to disguise gaits a little bit later. Here's just some snippets of the various newspaper reports that occurred at the time. You can see where they are from the Sun, the Telegraph, the Times, and the Guardian. And here's just a note from what's in Guinness World Records, which you heard mentioned. It just confirms what took place, which was a rather bizarre inquiry that occurred, but nevertheless it just clarifies what actually occurred at that time. What you see on the left here is a jewellery shop in Kingston. The 2 images you see on the left-hand side are of the jewellers, so that's an unknown person, and from a forensic perspective. And on the right-hand side is the person on the right we're looking at. We have surveillance footage, an image. Bear in mind these are stills; they're not moving images, and it's just for illustrative purposes. And you can see that what we're talking about, it's a large magnitude of the bow-leggedness of the person is what we're concerned with. And this is actually not the greatest quality material. These were analog tapes. Nowadays we deal mainly in digital material. Occasionally analog tapes will roll out, but usually it's digital nowadays. 15 years ago, it was all tapes in the UK. So subsequently, it's been used for further evidential cases, comparing unknowns to knowns. It's been used to find people. Some of you may know the horrific case of that was reported massively in the media. The operation name was Minstead, that you may not know of, but the case name was R versus Delroy Grant. It was the Night Stalker was the name that the media gave this person, who was the Metropolitan Police's longest unsolved serial rape case. If you're thinking about how many cases the gate's been used in, you're probably approaching about 1,000 over the last 15 years, most of which have been since about 2005. This particular case, without getting too far into it, there was 205 offences, as I said, over 17 and a half years. They couldn't find the guy. There was a couple of errors that occurred. Had those errors not occurred, they may well have found him. But in the space of 3 months from deploying the gate identification technology, they'd found him. £150 million circa is what was spent over 17 and a half years. And it cost them less than £15,000 with all the work that was done over a 3-month period in all aspects with gate and the other tools as well. So it does have a role to play. But the legal system was always going to determine whether it had a role to play, and rightly so. So we have the evidential use of is person A, person B. We have the investigative use of who is this person. And then we have the much more recent event of being able to look at a person's gait and determine whether there's anything unusual with their gait as to whether they might be about to commit something unpleasant, particularly here, a suicide bomber. When people walk, they move their arms. There's been cases where suicide bombers don't do that. I won't get too far into the details, but it just gives you an outline of, are we talking pre-event or are we talking prevent, as to the different areas within identification that gait is having a role in. One other area is, if we look at human remains, for those of you who don't know, this is the hip joint. You can see the hole within the hole, which is a heavy-duty erosion. And I was asked to look at some remains and whether we could predict, given what was going on with certain other parts of the skeleton, how this person would have walked. To put that into the mix, along with facial mapping and some other tools, to see whether we could actually get to the point of being able to find out who this person was. It did lead to the identification of a name of a person, but I do not believe it's actually led to anything further than that. Two of the most important questions. So what information can we derive from the material? The material in this case is the video footage of the CCTV, or it's the custody suite footage, which is known material, we know that person is, or surveillance footage. But also, we have a test we have to apply before we can do an analysis. And that's a very simple scientific test of is the quality of the material suitable for an analysis to be performed? Sometimes we'll see things, and sometimes then we'll see other things. And I think this particular little clip for you will help to just illustrate that point. There's many factors we look at with regards to gait in terms of whether we can use the material, and then if we are going to use the material, what distortions are there potentially, and not just potentially but realistically. And there's just a few things there. We talked about gait patterns earlier in relation to the very first case, and there's obviously different ways that people might try to disguise the way in which they walk.
We must inspect this part. You British fools, always you are trying to escape.
But always we are finding you.
Always, yeah.
Here you go.
There is no way the wool you are pulling over our eyes. Klaus, open the gate. Come on, come on.
So as you can see, as beautifully depicted by Dave Allen there many years ago, may he rest in peace, that there's different ways that people will use to disguise the way they walk. But you can't disguise these things. This is just a quick snapshot of 3 features of gait that a person's not going to be able to easily disguise, no matter within reason what they do. At the extreme end of things, yes, these things can be disguised, but broadly speaking, more difficult than one might first think. So what do we use it for? Well, I won't run through all the items there for you, but I've listed 3 at the bottom, and the CEOPS is the Child Exploitation Online Protection Service. And gait is being used in that now as well, in terms of gait analysis is being used in that as well, particularly around features of gait. But there's one key thing that occurred with regards to the horrific gerontophile rapist that I touched on earlier, in terms of the Met Police's longest unsolved case that was at the time for a serial rape. And the gait analysis was used for suspicion to arrest. It got to the point where some old-fashioned policing was being deployed, and one of the clips occurred on a particular stakeout looking at particular models of vehicles, and one officer says to the other, "That guy walks like the gait expert said." That's what's called allows suspicion to arrest. There's independent expert advice that allows an officer to be able to take it a step further and go and ask someone some questions. There's good reason. And this person was walking across someone's lawn at 10 to 1 on a Sunday morning in November 2009, right at the end of it. And this is a classic example of how you use one forensic tool to get to use another, because the officer was dissatisfied with the explanation the person gave, arrested him, and at that point, after the arrest is done, you're allowed, with certain offences, to be able to do what's called a buccal cavity swab of the mouth, cotton bud in your mouth, effectively. And from that, you can get the DNA. And after that, because all the DNA was for the offences was on the database, but the actual known DNA was in terms of the actual person committing the offences, that was pretty much the end of the story. So what does the future hold? Well, this is a front page of the Evening Standard in London on the Friday before the August bank holiday, where 2 guys dressed up in burqas, and the public identified them as called the police because they didn't walk like men. Sorry, they didn't walk like women. And it leads very nicely into the fact that as society moves on, as education moves on in all its broadest terms, that we're reliant upon, and rightly so, the expertise of other people to be able to help things move forward and educate the public in a whole variety of ways. And I think that if you look at the work that Peter James has done and the detail that he's written about in terms of the books where he's included forensic gait analysis, the one thing that's been admirable beyond belief is the adherence to the way the tool can be used without distortion. Thank you very much.